Hello, everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. My name is Ethan, and today I will be watching the final episode of Extra History's Japanese Militarism series. This episode is called Marco Polo. It's been an interesting series up until this point, and I'm ready to get into it. Hopefully, you guys are. So let's get started.
League of Nations General Assembly, Geneva, Switzerland, February 24th, 1930.
Oh, shit's about to go down, I suspect.
Everyone knows this vote will be tense. After the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the League of Nations had tasked British politician Lord Lytton to investigate the circumstances of what's increasingly become known as the Mukden Incident.
Yeah.
The Lytton Commission's report ascribes blame on both sides. But it also says that the Kwantung Army had not acted in self-defense and calls the puppet state of Manchukuo illegitimate. Japanese troops should withdraw.
Uh-oh.
Now the League of Nations votes to condemn Japan as the aggressor. 42 votes in favor, 2 opposed. And in response, Japanese Ambassador Matsuoka steps up to the podium. Japan, however,
Here it comes. Here comes the bombshell.
says, finds it impossible to accept the report conducted by the assembly. He then walks down the aisle and exits the hall, followed by the Japanese delegation. They've just withdrawn from the League of Nations.
Pretty famous incident, Japan withdrawing from the League of Nations. It also shows one of the reasons why the League of Nations isn't effective, which is that there's no enforcement power. I mean, in many ways, this is pretty similar to the modern UN. They can make decisions and they can denounce stuff, but especially the League of Nations, and to some extent the UN, has very weak enforcement power. I mean, the League of Nations basically had no enforcement power. They really couldn't compel anyone to do anything. So Japan can just do what it wants and then walk out. The UN has more enforcement power, but it obviously still struggles to actually enforce its decisions.
Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. When Japan quit the League of Nations in 1933, it abandoned the most prominent international organization meant to guard against a new world war. And they weren't the only ones. That November, the new German Chancellor Adolf Hitler held a successful referendum on withdrawing from the League.
Yep.
And in 1937, fascist Italy quit when the League condemned its actions in what is now Ethiopia. In honesty, Japan had long been frustrated with the League, arguing that it treated Asian nations differently from those of Europe or North America. They'd condemned Japanese actions in Manchuria, but happily let Britain and France set up colonial puppet states of their own in the Middle East. But even in direct diplomatic talks, Japanese ambassadors did themselves no favors by hiding the fact that their military was out of control. It saved Japan from looking weak and divided, sure, but as diplomats increasingly made assurances to foreign nations, only to have the military violate them, it made Japan appear untrustworthy and deceptive. The result was that Japan diplomatically isolated itself, removing all leverage on the world stage
Yeah, well, I guess it's got to find some new allies.
and leaving the government no tools to enact its foreign policy apart from one, military action. So, bereft of allies,
Here we go.
Ambassador Matsuoka pioneered an anti-communist pact with the fascist states of Germany and Italy.
Japan and relationship with the United States and Britain. Alright, gotta find some new friends. How about Hitler and Mussolini? Quite the crew you've fallen in with, but I will say all three countries do have some common interests in expansion and militarism, so quite the fitting alliance, but also, couple of evil fellows. So not the greatest. Not great at all. And of course, this is going to lay the groundwork for what's going to happen in World War II, this alliance. So, pretty consequential.
Yet despite all that, things in Japan were kinda quiet. For 2 years, not much progressed. There were no domestic or international incidents, and the economy improved, though unrest still simmered. A corruption scandal brought down the prime minister in 1934, leading to further dissatisfaction with civilian rule. And in 1935, a factional dispute between officers at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy formed the prelude of what would come next. It happened like this. When military authorities uncovered a group of young officers plotting a coup at the academy, they expelled them and forced the Inspector General of Military Education, a prominent Imperial Way faction leader, into retirement. Then, when he was replaced by a general who led the rival Control faction, Imperial Way officers took it as evidence that the whole crackdown had been a setup. In retaliation, an Imperial Way officer walked into the general's office and murdered him with a sword. The killer's trial once again inflamed the public and convinced the Imperial Way that it was finally time to move against their enemies. The February 26th incident, Tokyo, 1936, 4 a.m.
You've really got to be careful when giving trials to political figures, because it often doesn't end up the way you want it to end up. I mean, there's a lot of examples of this. You could look at Danton in the French Revolution. If you give people who are willing to speak and speak fairly eloquently a chance to talk, even at a trial, and if the public sympathizes with them, then the trial may do you more harm than good.
They called themselves the Righteous Army, gathering in the snowy barracks grounds, showing a postage stamp to indicate they're in on the plot. These are young and excited men. Their plan is to restore the emperor to power. With a rallying cry adapted from the old Meiji Restoration slogan, "Revere the Emperor, destroy the traitors." They assemble, nearly 1,600 strong, and march into the city center.
Oh, wow.
At 5 a.m., they attack multiple targets simultaneously. Key buildings, moderate and liberal politicians, and their enemies, the Control faction, especially those who signed the Washington Naval Treaty. They besiege the Prime Minister's residence, shooting it out with police officers. And once through, they murder the Prime Minister and use a photo to confirm their kill. Confirming, of course, that they killed the wrong man. Only days later, they'll learn that their target had escaped, and they'd actually killed his brother-in-law.
It's kind of
they
embarrassing.
also storm the finance minister's house and kill him in his bed. They shoot an imperial advisor, a former prime minister, in front of his wife. Then they board a truck and head to the house of the new Inspector General of Military Education, the replacement for the Control faction general murdered in the Military Academy incident, and machine gun him as his young daughter hides behind a table.
God damn,
They
brutal.
ransack a liberal newspaper, seize the Ministry of War, and take control of police headquarters. More assassination squads storm houses, but the occupants manage to slip away, and the group trying to take control of the palace doesn't succeed. The rebels then make their demands known. An Imperial Way-dominated cabinet, a full restoration of imperial power, and their leader, previously forced into retirement, instated as prime minister. But when Emperor Hirohito is informed, he's unequivocal. The plot must be crushed now. For 2 days, there's a flurry of negotiation. The rebels receive statements of support from some ministers, but the winds are changing. The emperor is firm that this must end, with force if necessary. By the morning of the 29th, rebels in the capital look out to see themselves surrounded by 20,000 loyalist troops and 40 warships in Tokyo Bay. Airdropped pamphlets blow in the wind, each saying the emperor has ordered them to stand down. Every radio airwave repeats this same message, and an enormous balloon carries a banner telling them not to resist. They give up. With the emperor publicly against them, they could not claim to be acting in his interest.
Yeah.
It turned out all Hirohito had to do to stop this madness was speak up, a thing he could have done after any of the previous...
Yeah, it's almost like when everyone's claiming to do things in your honor and for you, what it takes is you speaking out and denouncing them for, to perhaps curtail those things, at least to a certain extent.
Incidents, or any that happened afterward. And yet, he didn't. No public trials this time. No soapbox to spread radicalism. The leaders are tried behind closed doors and shot without media present. Imperial Way officers are purged from the army or sent to inglorious far-off postings. But militarism only got stronger. On March 9th, the Prime Minister's cabinet...
Yeah, I mean, it's good that they didn't give him a big public trial this time, but it does seem, too little too late. I mean, so much has happened at this point that you're not really going to end the militarism and the growing radicalism of a lot of your military through, one successfully handled coup.
Terrified, disgraced by their inability to prevent the chaos, and unable to function, resigned, which paved the way for a cabinet stacked with former, and for the first time, current military officers. By threatening to resign and not appoint new members, the military could make any prime minister fall. It effectively held veto on all policy, and its hold over the government would only grow stronger. The next year, on July 7, 1937, Japanese troops stationed outside of Beijing got into a confused nighttime encounter with a Chinese city garrison. Shots were exchanged, and when negotiations failed, both sides called for reinforcements. Tensions mounted. At 4:45 on July 8th, at a place known as Marco Polo Bridge, Chinese units fired on massing Japanese forces for an unknown reason. In response, 5,000 Japanese troops attacked, and the Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. And it wouldn't end until 1945.
Yeah, you know, this starts in 37 and continues through the Second World War. But I think it's a very understudied element of the Second World War. Like, most people don't think about any conflict starting until 1939, you know, when Hitler goes for Poland. But this conflict had already been going on for 2 years beforehand, which I don't think a lot of people are aware of.
At which point it had merged with the Second World War and killed around 22 million people.
Jesus.
But the Japanese government got a preview of that in 1937, when it began to hear sickening reports of troops carrying out an unprecedented civilian massacre after taking Nanjing. But for the Japanese government, the problems went beyond an increasingly unaccountable military. Because while both military factions had wanted war with China, neither had a strategic plan for how or what to do with it. Their doctrines were ideological positions, not military aims. They had no objective of when to stop, no strategy of how to hold and administer what they seized. The promised resources meant to secure and enrich Japan went right back into the war effort. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Japan scooped up its colony in Indochina. In retaliation, the United States placed an embargo on steel and petroleum, the most necessary raw materials in modern war. So then, desperate for war materials, Japan moved on the British and Dutch colonies of Southeast Asia in order to secure their resources. They would supply their war by starting new wars. To cloak the action in idealism, Japan announced it would liberate the nations of Asia from colonialism.
Yeah, liberate.
And lead them in a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Right. And so this is sort of, and you know, initially, a lot of Asian peoples were sort of excited to hear this. You know, they don't want to be ruled by their European overlords. You know, being liberated sounds pretty good. But the issue is that what the Japanese military means by liberation is domination by Japan. So, you know, you've gone from one colonial overlord to another when the peoples of Asia, they want true liberation and freedom, the ability to rule themselves, or a true Pan-Asian Union, not one that's ruled with Japanese, you know, ruling over everybody at the top.
In reality, it was a license to replace Western colonialism with their own. In 1940, all political parties dissolved, consolidated into the Imperial Rule Assistance Association as a way to combat factionalism. It officially joined the Axis powers and began working toward a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Japanese politics, from the village level, were reorganized to support total war. And fearing attack by the United States, while the military was already so tied down, a group of officers began formulating a plan to break America's naval power in the Pacific. An action that would invite a conflagration larger than the Great Kanto earthquake and the end of a path no one knew they were walking. As we've seen with this series, history rarely...
Yeah, idea to attack Pearl Harbor. Not a great one. You know, you gotta know that you can destroy the entire U.S. Navy, which is not what happened. But you could do that, but it's going to be rebuilt relatively quickly, and then the United States is going to come for you. And we all know how that went. Not well at all for Japan. But yeah, that was an interesting series. I find that the growth of, you know, militarism and ultranationalism depicted in Japan here is, in some ways, pretty similar to that of Italy, Germany, Spain. Examples that I know a little bit more about. So I think it's sort of interesting to see the parallels and sort of the, you know, global trends that were occurring during the 1920s and the 1930s. So yeah, that was a good series. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I certainly did. If you have suggestions for other videos I should react to, you know, leave them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this one, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I hope you guys have a good day. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye, everybody.